Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to New Zealand. Thomas Hall was born in Kingston upon Hull in Yorkshire in England in January 1848. He was the son of Thomas and Sarah Hall, who had a large farm. However, while he was still quite young, the family emigrated to New Zealand, where they settled in the town of Timaru. His father once again began to farm, and when Thomas finished his education, he was given the responsibility for managing a sheep station owned by his uncle, Mr. John Hall, a gentleman who would later serve as the Premier of New Zealand. By the 1870s, Thomas had moved into business and established himself as a commission agent. He became a partner in a firm called Hall & Meeson, which dealt with land transactions and financial arrangements, but also did some money lending. In a growing colonial town such as Timaru, such work could be profitable, and Thomas was determined to take full advantage of it. He was well known and well liked locally, and moved comfortably within society. He was also frequently seen in the company of young ladies, and was considered by many to be an eligible bachelor. However, although he presented himself as successful and well-positioned, beneath the surface, his business dealings were causing him financial strain. On the 26th of May 1885, he married a young lady named Catherine Kane, who was the stepdaughter of Captain Henry Kane, one of Timaru's earliest settlers, who had also served as a town mayor. Captain Kane was not pleased with his stepdaughter's choice of husband. However, by October 1885, he began to change his mind about Thomas Hall. The two men settled their differences, and Thomas became a frequent visitor, calling on the captain on a regular basis. Captain Kane lived in quite a grand residence, while Thomas and Catherine lived in a small house just outside the town, along with a young woman named Miss Margaret Houston, who acted as Mrs. Hall's companion. Before the marriage, Thomas insisted that his wife make a will that would place all her assets under his control in the event of her death, and Thomas also arranged for substantial life insurance policies to be taken out in her name. One was payable upon her death, while the other depended on her dying within a specified period. Even though they had not been married long, these arrangements did not appear to be out of the ordinary. Early in 1886, Captain Kane fell ill, and Thomas would go to his house to look after him. The captain complained that whiskey, which he had been accustomed to taking for many years, now caused him to vomit. It was known that Thomas would often give Captain Kane his whiskey whenever he came to visit. The captain's condition did not improve, and on the 29th of January 1886, he died. Following his death, Thomas and Catherine moved into the large house, bringing Miss Houston with them. In June 1886, Catherine gave birth to a baby boy. However, the occasion, which might otherwise have marked a period of stability and contentment, was soon overshadowed by concern, as Catherine's health began to decline. She was attended by Dr. Patrick McIntyre, who found her symptoms difficult to explain. The pattern of her illness did not fit neatly with common diagnosis, and her condition seemed to fluctuate in ways that caused him increasing unease. Matters took a more serious turn when an incident occurred involving a visitor who was helping to look after Mrs. Hall. A cup of tea that had been prepared for her was accidentally consumed by the visitor, who also became ill, with very similar symptoms to Catherine. When Dr. McIntyre was informed, he immediately began to suspect that whatever was affecting the two women may not be due to natural causes. He arranged for a sample of vomit to be sent for chemical analysis, the results of which confirmed the presence of antimony, a substance known for its toxic properties. With this finding, the situation could no longer be regarded as uncertain. The police were contacted and searched the property. They found traces of antimony among Thomas Hall's effects, and they also discovered a medical volume entitled Taylor on Poisons, a work that detailed toxic substances and their properties. On the 15th of August 1886, Thomas Hall and Miss Margaret Houston were arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Miss Catherine Hall. Despite the arrest, a measure of sympathy remained with Thomas's parents, who had for many years been regarded as distinguished and well-respected residents of Timaru. The arrest caused great excitement in the town, and news spread quickly from street to street, drawing curious onlookers and sparking constant discussion among residents, all eager to learn the particulars of the case. Further investigation by police led them to discover that on the 8th of December 1885, Mr. Thomas Hall had forged a transfer of a mortgage from Mr. Michael Mitten to himself and Mr. Gilbert Meeson. They also found proof that on the 16th of July 1886, Mr. Hall had forged a promissory note for a payment of £225. Mr. Gilbert Meeson, a partner in the business run by Mr. Hall, was asked whether he would give evidence, to which he agreed. Over the next few days, more forgeries were uncovered, and Mr. Thomas Hall now faced a growing number of additional charges. He was kept in the prison at Littleton, and on the 27th of September, it was decided to exhume the body of his wife's stepfather, Captain Henry Kane. A post-mortem examination was then carried out, which revealed in his body the presence of a significant quantity of antimony. When this discovery became known, it caused widespread shock through Timaru. What had already drawn strong public attention now raised more serious questions, as many began to wonder whether Captain Kane's death had in fact been the result of a deliberate poisoning. By now, fresh charges were formally laid against Mr. Thomas Hall, particularly in connection with forgery. What had first centred on the suspected poisoning of his wife had now widened, and as further details were placed before the magistrates, it was decided that a trial would be held at the Supreme Court in early October. Miss Margaret Houston was also accused and charged with the attempted murder of Mrs. Catherine Hall by administering poison. When the trial began in the city of Christchurch on Monday the 11th of October 1886, the interest from the press and the public was such that the area around the court was packed and entrance was by ticket only. It was described as one of the most remarkable cases ever heard in a colonial criminal court. The jury would have to consider whether Mr. Thomas Hall and Miss Margaret Houston had attempted to poison Mrs. Catherine Hall, and Mr. Hall was also being charged with 12 charges of forgery. It had been decided, however, that at this stage, Mr. Hall would not face the charge of murdering Captain Kane. In addressing the jury, Mr. Justice Johnson first referred to the great importance of the case and the seriousness of the charge. It was explained that Mr. Hall was a land broker from Timaru and Mrs. Catherine Hall was his wife, and since the beginning of the year they had been living in a place called Woodlands. The court was told that Miss Houston also lived with them, though her exact position in the household was unclear, as she appeared to be on close and friendly terms with both Mr. and Mrs. Hall, and also performed some domestic duties. It was explained that on the 19th of June, Mrs. Hall had given birth to a child, and that prior to this, in November of the previous year, she had suffered from symptoms of distress, which included vomiting, and her medical attendant had naturally attributed this to pregnancy. However, following the birth of her child, similar symptoms appeared and continued thereafter. The court was then told that shortly before the arrest, vomit from Mrs. Hall had been analysed by doctors McIntyre and Drew and was found to contain antimony, a mineral irritant poison. Before finishing outlining the case, the court was told that on one occasion, ice water that had been given to her caused violent sickness, so it was tasted by a nurse and found to be bitter, and when that water too was later analysed, it also showed that it contained a significant quantity of antimony. The prosecution told the court that following the arrest of the prisoners, Mrs. Hall's condition rapidly improved. So presuming that Mrs. Hall had been poisoned, the question then arose, by whom had the poison been administered? Witnesses included 2 female servants and a nurse who had assisted in attending Mrs. Hall. They told the court that Mr. Hall himself was in the habit of entering his wife's room and sometimes giving her tea. The servants denied any knowledge of improper substances being given to Mrs. Hall, but they both confirmed that Mr. Hall had ample opportunity to administer poison. Evidence was presented that showed that before Mrs. Hall displayed any signs of being poisoned, Mr. Thomas Hall had been reading medical books, particularly books that had details of poisons. It was claimed that he had also purchased a considerable amount of tartar emetic, which was a form of antimony. The prosecution was led by Robert Stout, and he told the court that at the time of Mr. Hall's arrest, he had attempted to dispose of something in his pockets, and that a file was later found, along with a cork, both of which upon analysis showed traces of antimony. Inspector Broham gave testimony and said that when it became apparent that Mr. Hall was unable to retrieve the file, he became very anxious. The inspector also said that when a book of poisons was discovered during a search of the premises, Mr. Hall had remarked, "I suppose this will tell against me." As to motive, it was stated that Mr. Hall had been in serious financial difficulty and that a forged promissory note was soon to fall due, and he was in urgent need of money. The court was told that he had insured his wife's life only a few weeks before her illness began and had encouraged her to make a will leaving everything she owned to himself. The press had reported that an attempt had been made to set fire to the house and that Mr. Hall may have been connected with this, as kerosene had actually been found hidden in an outbuilding. However, as this would probably not have been provable in court, it had been left out of the proceedings. Turning to Miss Houston, the prosecution claimed that she had been on very familiar terms with Mr. Hall, and while there was no clear evidence of an improper relationship, their conduct suggested a degree of intimacy. It was stated that she would sometimes enter his bedroom, bring him tea in the morning, and remain there for some time, and it had been noted that on occasions she had been seen behaving playfully with him in a manner that suggested undue familiarity. Witnesses were also presented who had seen them out together on various occasions, and who had told the court in private she addressed him as Tom, while he referred to her as Meg or Meggie. Given this closeness, it was suggested that Miss Houston was someone in whom Mr. Hall placed confidence, and that she too had ample opportunity to administer poison. Other circumstances that were presented included Miss Houston's reactions at the time of Mr. Hall's arrest. A police officer stated that when Mr. Hall was charged with administering antimony, Miss Houston attempted to free his hands so he could remove something from his pockets. Inspector Broham added that both her words and her actions suggested that she was aware of the poisoning. The letters that Miss Houston had written to Mr. Hall while both were in prison were presented to court, and they all indicated a high degree of familiarity. However, when Miss Houston was asked about this, she claimed they were merely written in a way to cheer him up. The defence argued that Miss Houston had absolutely no personal motive to poison Miss Hall, and stressed that there was no evidence suggesting that Mrs. Hall's death would benefit Miss Houston. When all the evidence had been heard, the prosecution and defence delivered their final arguments before the judge summed up the case. The prosecution reminded the jury how Mrs. Hall's condition had been worsening over time due to ingesting poison, and that it was highly unlikely that this had happened due to an accident or by self-administration. They stressed that both Mr. Hall and Miss Houston had constant access to Mrs. Hall, and that Mr. Hall had purchased antimony, had studied its effects, was in urgent need of money, and his wife's death would have provided him with much-needed financial relief. When the jury was sent out to deliberate, they did so for less than 10 minutes, before returning to find Mr. Thomas Hall guilty of attempted murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. Miss Houston's involvement was less clearly defined, and she was acquitted. Even as the judgment was delivered, further questions remained, and there were calls to charge Thomas Hall for the murder of Captain Henry Kane. It was known that for some time before the captain's death, Thomas had been in serious financial difficulty and had resorted to forgery to relieve his situation. So in many ways, Captain Henry Kane's death would have brought him financial benefit. The captain had two stepdaughters, Mrs. Catherine Hall, Thomas's wife, and Mrs. Newton. However, there was no clear evidence that Thomas had known the exact terms of Captain Kane's will, which had divided the property between the two women. But there had been financial arrangements, which made the captain's death advantageous to Thomas. Under one agreement, his wife and her sister shared income from certain funds, and in another, made in December 1885, Catherine had been granted a life annuity of £300 per year and the use of the house where Captain Kane had lived. In addition, before her marriage, Mrs. Hall had placed all her property in trust, meaning that Thomas could not directly control it, even though he had asked that to be set aside, a request that had been strongly opposed by Captain Kane and which had caused friction between the two men. After all this was taken into account, it was decided that there was enough evidence to charge Thomas Hall with murder. At his trial, Thomas was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, the case did not end there. An appeal was lodged, and the conviction was overturned on a technical point of law. The outcome caused considerable reaction, with many people believing that Thomas Hall had got away with murder. He remained in Mount Eden prison for many years, before eventually being released in 1907. His release, however, was accompanied by certain conditions. An allowance was granted to him, reportedly arranged through family influence, on the understanding that he would leave New Zealand and not return. By this time, his personal circumstances had changed significantly. His wife had been granted a divorce and had gone to live in England with their son. Thomas did leave New Zealand after his release, but the details of his life from there are uncertain. Some reports suggest that he travelled to England, while others indicate that he may have settled in Australia. It has been claimed that he lived under another name and attempted to support himself through modest means, including the sale of photographs. There are also suggestions that he sought permission to return to New Zealand, but was not allowed to do so. For many years, the official record held that the date and place of his death was unknown. However, the biographer Peter Graham has proposed that he may have spent his final years in the Australian town of Yeppoon and that he was buried there under an assumed identity. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case